Triumphs from, I don't know, Speed Twin, Tiger 100, Thunderbird, all the way up. And I think it's the twin carbs and the setup of the motor, the way the engines, you know, even pre-unit ones, it's the way they run. They're super runners. Okay, you get a little vibro massage, which is part of the Triumph mystique, but they're very simple engines to work with, very mechanical friendly, very rider friendly, plenty of urge, and I just love them.
It's just one of them names throughout like biking history that you sort of like think, yeah, everybody's heard of a Bonneville. The new Triumph produced out of Hinkley. They've just produced their first twin, and again called it the Bonneville. So it does have that magic name. Has its magic name. It goes back. Marlon Brando rode a Thunderbird in the Wild One, and the Triumph name then was associated with that sort of wild riding approach. The Bonneville followed, and it was fast. It held several speed records, so it captured the public imagination in terms of speed. Its style was always better, in somebody who loves Triumphs point of view, than any of the other British makes. The styling was sporty, it was innovative, it performed magically, and people took the engine out and put it into Norton frames to make Triumph and McCaffrey races, and it was that performance and the image of Triumph.
The Bonneville was not born as a result of one man's genius or moment of inspired doodlings at a drawing board. It was a hybrid, an amalgam of ideas and technical developments that Triumph had experimented with on various models throughout the 1950s. The design team was led by General Manager Edward Turner, whose combination of design flair and marketing talent would see Triumph's fortunes soar in the years after the Second World War. The 1950s had begun with the launch of the Thunderbird. This 650cc vertical twin was designed with the North American market very much in mind, a market vital to any model's success. Sporty British motorbikes were very popular in the States at this time, and the new 650 twin helped underline Triumph's dominance in this market. It was capable of 100 miles per hour, which was pretty spectacular for the day. And it was speed that mattered most. In 1954, Triumph launched the Tiger T110. Whereas the T-Bird engine could deliver 34 brake horsepower, the T110 had 42 brake horsepower, making it Triumph's fastest motorcycle to date. But the engines in the T-Bird and Tiger had iron cylinder blocks. This limited the amount of performance that could be squeezed out of them, as they were prone to overheating, particularly when being used in competition, as many were. Indeed, win on Sunday, sell on Monday became something of a mantra for anyone trying to promote their machine. In 1956, a new alloy cylinder head was developed, which was both stronger and lighter.
In 1956, the American market were demanding twin carb machines, production machines, and the start of the Bonneville really was the 1956 TR5R. There was 99 of them built for Daytona racing, and they were very, very successful. And then they started making the T100, the 500 Delta head, up until from 57 to 59. And then the Americans wanted more horsepower, so they made the 650, which came out in 59. It was built in 58, but for the 59 season. And this really was the start of the Bonneville, the TR5R. The 99 that were produced with the factory all went to America. They left the factory as a standard bike, and then they were altered when they got to America. And they were mainly used for Daytona racing in America.
It was the 650 engine with the Delta head and twin carbs installed in what was otherwise a T110 that became the T120, or Bonneville. It was called the Bonneville after the salt flats in Utah, which were used for many speed record attempts.
Triumph Bonneville, it's a wonderful name, isn't it? Just the sound of it sounds really exciting. Triumph Bonneville. Bonneville, the name comes from the Bonneville salt flats in Utah, where traditionally the Americans have had a speed week. And so lots of records have been set at Bonneville. And in 1956, Johnny Allen, with an iron engine Triumph Thunderbird, set the land speed record there in a cigar. When I say cigar, I mean in a long projectile fully enclosed. That machine can be seen at the National Motorcycle Museum at Solihull in Birmingham. And because of the success, it was never officially ratified by the FIM, the Fédération Internationale Motocycliste. But everybody knew that this was really the fastest machine on two wheels in the world, and so it was generally accepted, although never officially ratified, that this was the land speed record.
Bonneville seemed an appropriate name for the new model, given Triumph's ever-anxious eye on the US market. And in 1959, the new model T120 went on sale in both the United States and Great Britain. But there were reservations within Triumph, whether it was the right thing to do. Indeed, Edward Turner was certain that the T120 would take the firm into bankruptcy. The uncertainty meant that the Bonneville did not even appear in Triumph's 1959 catalogue. The misgivings proved to be unfounded, for the Bonneville was an overnight sensation.
It looked the part, even when just looking at standing still, the Bonneville looked like it was doing 100 miles an hour just standing still like.
When I was 16, which was September 59, I had a 350 3T 1948 Triumph, because then didn't have any restrictions as a learner. And a friend of mine had a little 50cc item, and our ambition was to have a brand new Tiger Cub each. And we used to sit at mine in the evenings and look at the latest Triumph brochure, and on one side was the Tiger Cub, and on the facing page was the Bonneville, 1960 Bonneville. And my friend used to say to me, "Oh, you'll end up with one of those, not a Tiger Cub." And I said, "Oh no." But, sure enough, he ended up with a 250 Greaves, and I ended up with a 1960 Bonneville.
When the Bonneville went on sale, it was fitted with the 650cc engine with the splayed inlet ports, a single-piece camshaft, and twin carbs. The 4-speed gearbox was housed in a separate casting to the engine block, resulting in one of the most distinguishing features of the early Bonneville. But despite the excitement, the first Bonnies were far from perfect. There were problems with vibration. And the spindly front forks and a flexing frame meant that the Bonneville had a tendency to weave and wobble. Also, the headlamp nacelle, which was lifted directly off the T110, did not suit the new machine, especially when fitted with US specification handlebars, as in this example. But today, these machines are very sought after. No detail is too insignificant for those who restore these machines to their original condition.
I'll be honest with you, at that particular time, a Bonneville was a Bonneville. I mean, it wasn't like today. It's the mystique thing is everybody on the Bonneville, you know, everyone's running around Bonneville. It was just a Bonneville, you know. It's become a legend as time's gone on, really, as opposed to then. Everybody, it was an everyday bike. I mean, people say if you put a twin carb head on a bike, it was classed as a Bonneville. If it had Tiger and Center on the crankcase, it wasn't. You know, people weren't looking at numbers like they do today. They're straight down the crankcase. It's a T120, you know. It's a look-alike. It's a mock-up. But in them days, everything was a mock-up, really. You know, there wasn't many original bikes about. I mean, everything had been pulled off. I mean, the most common thing was the nacelles had been removed, a chrome headlamp, John Tickle headlight brackets had been fitted, and, you know, you had a chrome headlight stuck, and you thought that looked better than the nacelle. I mean, today, people wouldn't dream of it, you know.
When you're restoring a bike between the years of 56 to 59, this is the hardest head to get hold of, especially for the 650s. Normally, the heads are cracked. And as I say, for the 59 650, the casting on here was for 1 year only, so they're very, very hard to get hold of in good condition. And as you can see, this one's in as new condition.
The thing was in them days, when you were riding bikes, you did ride them flat out because you wasn't worried about damaging a nut and bolt and a screw, you know, and scratching the paintwork and all them little things you're going to do to restore one a day. And everything was available. I mean, today, if you fall off one of these bikes, you just spent a year restoring it, you've just spent all your hard-earned money on it, and you spent years running around trying to find original parts. You don't want to fall off them, you know, and today you really, your concept of driving along on a motorcycle down a country lane at 60 miles an hour, enjoying the scenery, is fantastic, because you're that much older. But at 18, 19, there weren't no scenery. All you wanted to see scenery was flashing by 100 miles an hour, as fast as you could go, and, you know, that's all you wanted. There was nothing else you was looking for. You was looking for sheer speed, really.
This 1962 Bonneville represents the last of the pre-unit line. Some felt that with the end of the pre-units, the Bonneville had lost its charisma. Today, these pre-63 machines are regarded as the classic classics in the Bonneville story.
It brings all the memories flooding back, even though this is a 62 American spec. And I had a 1960, English obviously. Basically it's the same bike, and when I came here this morning and saw it sitting there, you know, it just brought everything back, the thrill of owning something like this and riding it. And just to sit on it now, it's magic. There's no bad side to a Bonneville, but the timing cover side is the good side. That is the side you get in all the sales brochures, and it is much more attractive than the other side, to the extent that if I park it somewhere, a cafe or wherever, even if it meant turning it round, if I was parking it against a wall or something, I'd always make sure that the good side is the side that people could see.
This is the 1963, first year of the unit construction. It was 1 year only, because the difference on this particular model was they carried on using a lot of the pre-unit parts. It's got the pre-unit type forks on. It's also got the footrests here that were unique to the 63 model.
Although the purists may have balked at the shift to unit construction, Triumph had to find a way of keeping up with demand, particularly from the US, while keeping the lid on production costs. And manufacturing a single casing to house the motor and gearbox assemblies was a lot more efficient than producing them separately. The result was a much more compact, neater installation, helped in part by the elimination of the magneto for ignition purposes. The change to the unit engine was not the only change for 1963. The problem of cracking cylinder heads on earlier models was also addressed by a change to using a 9-stud fixing. In an attempt to counter the Bonneville's tendency to wobble and weave, the frame was given a thicker, single down tube, after experiments with a duplex design with twin down tubes failed to give significant improvement. The Arctic white finish was arguably the only strange choice, as it was well known that Americans preferred black bikes. Two areas that remained poor, however, were the brakes and electrics. Also, the problem of vibration would not go away. If anything, the combination of stiffer ride and the harsher running of the new engine exaggerated the effect. Today, such traits are regarded as part of the bike's charm, giving it a certain machismo. But back in the 1960s, these were real problems which were never satisfactorily addressed. But the Bonneville of 1963 was still an infant, but one of the great things about the machine was its development potential. Indeed, some wags have said that the Bonneville represents the triumph of development over design. But 1963 was to be the start of a golden era for Triumph motorcycles. Sales in the all-important US market were booming, so that they rose from 6,300 units in 1963 to 28,700 machines in 1967. But in the drive to meet the growing demand, Triumph had acquiesced quickly to the wage demands of the workforce. It was a policy that would come back to haunt the company a decade or so later as it struggled to survive in the early 1980s. This immaculate 1963 example is being ridden by Clyde Carley, who from 1979 to 81 was British grass track sidecar champion. Like many before him, Clyde used Triumph engines to help him win many a race. But what Triumph really needed was success in its own machines, and not merely as a supplier of engines. During the 1950s, the handling of Triumph's twins had been regarded as inferior to that of Norton. But by the early 60s, Norton's fortunes were declining, and several key men were persuaded to join Triumph. The result was a transformation, and Bonnevilles began distinguishing themselves on the road and track.
Well, a lot of young lads, and one in particular, he wanted to get 100 mile an hour over Chelsea Bridge. Because there was villains in them days to get speed over the bridge. And I'd done his engine for him, and he had a little misfire in it. So he said, would I use it for a night and try it? So I took it out, and past Brands Hatch, up to Johnson's Cafe, and as I come out the cafe at about 10 o'clock at night, there's all kinds of bikes, Gold Stars, Nortons, all kinds of bikes, and when I went out, they all followed me out. So it was a bit of a mad outfit myself, and we got through Kingsdown, out the area, and of course in them days you could do 100 mile an hour, really. And I thought, well, I was all tagging along, you know, and I thought, well, I gradually built up speed to about 70 mile an hour, and I thought, when I got outside Kingsdown, towards Brands Hatch,
I thought, right now, if you can catch me, catch me. And I crouched down, and this old Bonneville went around, and no one got near it.
But real credibility was created on the racetrack. Production racing was at its height, with long-distance events attracting enormous attention and prestige. The Bonneville was about to herald in an era of dominance for the Triumph marque.
This is a 65 Thruxton. It's the real first year of the Thruxtons. 65, I believe they built just over 50, and they built some in 66 and also 67. But it was the start of the Thruxton in 65. The difference between this and a standard Bonneville would have been they're very, very highly tuned, camshaft wise, polishing, jetting, and also they would have had the rear sets on them here. It would have been standard for a rev counter, also a fairing would have been fitted to them, and also the exhaust systems were different. It had bigger pipes on.
The 500 mile international in Great Britain was the premier production event in the whole of Europe, and most of the works teams in Europe were represented from Spain and Italy, and it was a big battle between Nortons and Triumphs. The race had been going on for something like, I think, 10 or 12 years, and it was always a great prestigious battle to see who could win.
This is the very machine Chris campaigned during the 60s in Britain and Europe. The Thruxton 500, Barcelona 24 hours, Zandvoort 6 hours. These were races that mattered back then. It was the first time he'd seen his old machine in 30 years.
Well, my earliest recollection was when I first saw it, which was, it had been purchased by a friend of mine, and he invited me to ride it in the 500 mile race in 1965. And I went to Snetterton a few days before the event in order to help run the machine in, because it was probably quite tight, and that was probably, I think, Tuesday or Wednesday before the Saturday event. We'd probably done, I don't know, perhaps an hour or so of careful running in, and there was an awful bang from the engine, and I was riding at the time, and I looked down the front and got a big hole in the front of the engine, and I was absolutely dismayed, because in those days I was penniless, and this was a great event really to be asked to allowed to ride the bike. And I brought it to a halt, and we took it back to the paddock, and my friend phoned Eddie Webb, who owned the bike. He phoned the factory, and it was back there sharpish, and fortunately the factory supplied us with a new engine ready for the Saturday's race meeting. So that's my first recollection, was a bit of a horror story. Well, the first time I really rode it was the Saturday that we came for 500 mile in 65, and I was tremendously impressed. It certainly had more power than anything I'd ridden before, and it was beautifully prepared, and the handling qualities were superb, and it allowed me to ride in the manner that I couldn't have done previously. I was very, very impressed, and I still am impressed with the handling qualities. I've never seen a rev counter that proceeded around the dial as fast as you could change gear. That's what really impressed me, I think, yeah. It took a bit of getting used to initially, because the power came in at 5,000 RPM, and you rode it between 5 and 7,500 in short circuit scratch racing, and probably between 5 and 7,000 for long distance events. And staying in that band, in that power band, with a 4-speed close box, it took a bit of getting used to, really. That's the only thing. If you got tight corners and hairpins occasionally, you really had to let it drag itself round. There's no good trying to slip the clutch or anything in a long distance race. But I couldn't say we really stood a chance of beating them, the works at factories at all, because their riders were sort of semi-professional people, and they really were out to win. A slightly different standard to us, but I think we did particularly well to stay pretty close to them. It was a good machine to run because it wasn't expensive to maintain. I mean, you could get all the parts easily, and they were surprisingly reliable. I think you didn't get a lot of trouble with them, although if you ran them for a long time, bits would go. And eventually, when I owned this machine in '68, I think by then
some of the parts were getting well used, and I did have a little bit bother with it. But after 3 years of hard racing, I think you've got to accept that. But they were easy to maintain. Well, I rode the SS Spitfires in the 24-hour race at Barcelona in 66 and 67. And I think the difference between the Spitfire and this is really the BSAs were much heavier to handle. Although they stayed on line well and steered superbly, you needed quite a bit of strength to put them into a corner and then picking them up again. And on a very short, well, it wasn't a short circuit, but a very twisty circuit, very tight circuit at Barcelona, it took a lot of strength to do that over 24 hours. And I found the Triumph was much sweeter. It went into a corner with just the gentlest of pressure and a slight pressure on the handlebars to lift it, and it would come up again, and that was nice. And the gear ratios were better. I think the BSAs never seemed to have a good close ratio gearbox. They had gaps, particularly between first and second. There was a big gap, and often you were waiting for the power to overcome the gap in the box. But these machines, they had beautifully chosen ratios, and they're much easier to handle. Well, I think it stayed quite competitive up until 1968 because the scene wasn't changing, and there was still the production scene was still 650 twins, the Nortons and Triumphs and things like that, and particularly the BSA Spitfires. But I could see that things were going to change because the Triumph Tridents, the triples, were coming into racing, and I knew that this wouldn't stay competitive much longer, and I think that's probably one of the reasons I retired at the end of '68 and then sold the bike on.
Britain's classic long-distance race on 2 wheels and the only event in the country that counts towards the World Endurance Championships. The International 500-mile Grand Prix at Thraxton in Hampshire begins with a Le Mans-type start.
But the Bonneville's racing days were not over yet. 1969 was to prove a memorable year. Not only did a Bonneville win the Thruxton 500, but Malcolm Uphill went on to set a new record at the Isle of Man TT. His average lap speed of 99.99 miles per hour electrified the world of motorcycling in a way that seems hard to imagine today.
Daytona, ridden by last year's winners Peter Butler and David Nixon, coming into the pits. For this year, the winner is Percy Tate on a work-centered Triumph Bonneville number 52, and his partnership with Malcolm Uphill takes the trophy. That time is a record for the race.
I certainly didn't expect to see it again, and in a strange way, I didn't really want to see it again, because it was certainly my favourite machine, and I wanted it to exist here, and not to see somebody else own it. And I thought it had vanished completely and probably been taken to bits and scattered and gone. But I'm pleased to see it again now, really. And it's nice to know that it'll be put back in completely original condition and looked after. Because it is a classic machine, and I think it's the ultimate 650. It's the ultimate Triumph twin. Because after they went to 750s, they were never quite as good, quite the same. And this is really the ultimate development from right back from the 1937 Speed Twin.
Meanwhile, racing in America was more akin to speedway, requiring markedly different versions of the Bonneville.
This particular model, again, was built for the American market only. It's the 66 T120 TT. This model was also used by Evel Knievel when he done his famous rocket jump. Quite a rare bike, as I say. It's the American market only. Had no silencers, just open pipes. It sounds absolutely tremendous. It's also fitted with energy transfer coil, so it carried no battery for lightness. Triumph's had very good success in America, flat tracking with these, equivalent to our Speedway in England. The braking was exactly the same as the standard Bonneville, but on the 66 model they did have the wider shoes, but that was on all 66 models. This particular bike is a Trackmaster frame fitted with a 69 Bonnie engine. The unique parts of this bike has been changed to a magneto, the ARD conversion on the front. The reason for this was it gave a better spark than the coil ignition, And as I say, it's got the lightweight trackmaster frame. This particular bike was ridden by Tom Rockwood. We believe it was the actual bike he won the Ascot Championship on in 1971. The trackmaster frame was a very lightweight frame, twin down tube, and it had the oil in the frame as well, to save obviously carrying an oil tank. This particular bike has been fitted with discs on the front, lights, and it's also running an alternator because it's been put on the road. When it was in its race form, it wouldn't have had any of this equipment. It would have had just a normal wheel in the front, no braking at all. It would have had the rear disc only. And as I say, it's got the ARD mag conversion, obviously for better sparking than the original coil ignition that would have been on the 69 Bonnevilles.
Although these TT specials may seem alien to a British audience, they were vital to the Bonneville success in the US. And yet, despite a different outward appearance, these Bonnevilles were virtually the same as their road-going cousins. The Bonneville was that versatile. This particular TT special is being ridden by someone who's no stranger to speed. In 1972, Freddie Cooper became the first person in Britain to ride a motorbike at over 200 miles per hour. He did it at the National Sprint Association trials at Greenham Common in October of that year. Although he used two Bonneville engines lashed together to achieve that record, even Freddie, who's well into his 70s, couldn't resist the charms of this TT machine, itching to open the throttle and give it its head. But by the end of the 60s, TT racing had died, thanks in part to the appearance of less suitable triples and the Vietnam War bleeding off many potential young riders. Some of the knowledge gained through TT racing in the US was to have an impact on the road-going Bonneville. The Trackmaster frame had contained the oil as a weight-saving measure. The idea was incorporated into Bonnevilles built from 1970 onwards. However, this was less to do with saving weight and more to do with saving space. But Japanese motorcycle sales were beginning to hurt British manufacturers. Honda had launched the four-cylinder CB750 in 1969, and it was taking customers away from Triumph. Whatever one's feelings are about Japanese machinery, Triumph could not ignore the fact that there were riders who simply wanted a more comfortable, quieter ride. In order to achieve greater smoothness, the Bonneville acquired various pipes, filters, plenum chambers, and so on. But all this required extra space, and so the opportunity to ditch the oil tank was not to be missed. However, adopting the oil-in-frame technology reduced the amount of oil that could be carried, and so from now on, Bonnevilles would run hot. One of the biggest influences on the 1971 Bonneville's appearance was to be found not on the racetrack, but in the cinema. The film Easy Rider had led to a demand for chopper styling, particularly in the US. Unfortunately, the Bonneville's new frame was taller than it had been, and so there was a limit to how far the stylists could go down this route. But Triumph was heading for choppy waters, for the Bonneville had risen in price. No longer could it boast Edward Turner's original claim to offer performance at an affordable price, especially in the face of a new generation of cheaper superbikes that were coming onto the scene. However, what Triumph had was something that could not be copied or manufactured: image. And the Bonneville had image by the spadeful. Today, the Bonneville name is probably more potent now than it ever was, thanks to the current seemingly insatiable demand for retro culture. Revivalist motorcycle events ensure that the myths will only be enhanced. Even the old venues are coming in for the makeover treatment.
It was a boys' club, a motorcyclist boys' club. Used to come down here and talk to the other blokes about motorbikes and swap ideas, swap parts, and swap Korean covers. But it was a big boys' club most of the time, and a great place to be if you've got a motorbike.
It was great. This place, well, it was like coming out of a post-war period, rationing, hardships, and all of a sudden getting a bike. and having a bit of fun in life, because I mean life was, them days in the 50s, pretty grey. I mean, I don't think people realise it unless you was round in our era. But having said that, I still say they were the golden days, without a doubt. We used to come down here, and then to spice things up a little bit, I started going out there. I mean, I wasn't a very good rider at first, you know, a bit of a novice really, up against people like Bill and all them. But eventually, I got the hang of it, and then I got a Triumph 110, and then we used to do what we never used to call it racing. We used to go out there and just give a performance, as the lads would say, you know, and it was great fun. Then the law would come along and try to spoil it all.
I used to almost live at a place called the Blinking Owl Cafe, which is on the South End Arterial Road. It was South End's answer to the Ace Cafe, I suppose. And weekends you'd get 200 or 300 bikes minimum parked out the front. And we used to have the usual runs down to South End seafront and back so you could get there the fastest. And in fact the South End police, in an effort to try and catch us, they even bought, I think it was 2 SP250 Daimler Darts. But they still couldn't catch us.
Outside the Ace Cafe, it used to be like, well, you used to have the entrance down here and this one here, with the intersection there, and we used to, I mean, I remember one night the law chased me down there, and I knew they was behind me, so I thought, oh, I'll have a bit of a laugh here with the lads, like, because I mean, this time, we're talking about down here in its heyday, I mean, nothing to see 300 or 400 bikes down there, and all the lads standing on the wall with the birds and all jeering, and, you know, having a great time. They thought, you know, especially when it was ridiculing the police, like, at the time. And then, of course, I'd give them what they want, like, you know, round and round the intersection with the law, and then after that, we'd shoot off up the road and just open it up, and, you know, people say, didn't you ever catch it? It wasn't that we were better riders than them, because they were good riders. I mean, don't get anybody wrong, the law were good riders. They were all, most of them blokes around them time were ex-army blokes, so they were the DR riders in the war, you know what I mean, who then come out of the forces and joined the police force, so they were no soft touch, but the only thing that held them back was their bikes were so heavy with all the radio equipment, and the aerials and the leg shields and the fire extinguishers and their first aid kits and all the gear they used to wear. So of course we had an advantage over them. It's like golf, having someone like a handicap, you know what I mean? So we had that advantage over them. And so like, of course you'd open up and he'd still be there, you know what I mean? So it wasn't a question of we were better riders, it's just a question, I think it was a weight ratio. But we had great fun in those.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever forget it. In the early 60s, if you had a Bonneville or a Gold Star, you were the real king. And spring 61, I bought a 9-month-old 1960 Bonneville, and the thrill of just looking at it, you know, without riding it, and just to make me so proud, just to own it, and it felt like $1 million.
The Bonneville was the archetypal bike for the talent boys. The Ace Cafe guys would drool over the Bonneville and develop Tritons to match the better road holding of the Norton featherbed frame with the better performance, arguably, of the Triumph Bonneville engine. They're just magic. To anybody who loves Triumphs, as most of us here do, the Bonneville was probably the bike.
The Nortons and the Gold Stars, the Goldies especially, the Goldies had a posh connotation. They were a bit expensive. The Nortons were a bit expensive, whereas my first Triumph, I think, cost me 119 quid new. The Speed Twin, with the L-spring hub in it. It was affordable. The Triumph was definitely affordable. The spares were affordable. It was a simple engine to maintain. Keep the tappets right and, you know, keep the chains adjusted right. It was, as I say, a rider-friendly, a mechanic-friendly motorcycle. A very simple design that Turner built, in the 30s, that really hadn't changed much. Everybody knew what went on inside the Triumph engine. You knew the camshafts. You've got the 313.4s were the optimum camshaft at the time because they had a great performance to them. But to get back to the Bonneville, it just built up. Its reputation built up and built up and built up. Until today, you say Bonneville and people say, you got a Bonneville? Yeah, I got a Bonneville. I got 2 actually.
The Triumph, well, as you know, it's a 650 twin carbs. It was quick, fast acceleration. In fact, I would say it was probably the fastest accelerated bike around. It was flexible. I wasn't impressed with the brakes too much, but we didn't worry about the brakes. All we was interested in is you know, my position on my throttle. Most people ride a bike. I didn't even bother about having a throttle cable. It was only shut off and on. That was it. There was no in between. You know, we used to wind them up and had a bit of fun with them, like, you know. It was a great era. It was a great era.
But it was an era that had run its course. By 1977, the Triumph factory had become a cooperative after the workforce staged a 10-month sit-in. This had been precipitated following news that most of them were to be sacked and production moved to save spiralling costs. Also, the Bonneville had become a 750 in an attempt to satisfy the demand for larger capacity machines. As a result, it had a new model number, the T140.
Triumph were continually looking to sell more motorcycles and saw their opportunity in 1977 to be both patriotic and to sell more bikes. To celebrate the Queen's Silver Jubilee, they submitted their proposals to the Palace, had them approved, and this bike was born. At £11.49, it was quite reasonably priced, and they produced 1,000. Initially, the one-piece side panels had 1 of 1,000 inscribed on them, but the first 1,000 sold so quickly that they'd like to produce some more, and clearly they couldn't call those 1 of 1,000, so they produced another 400 or so and had them stamped limited edition. Those were snapped up equally quickly. Every single one was sold, and a lot of them went into store. The main changes are cosmetic. It's designated T140J. The paintwork on the wheels, the tank, the side panels is distinctive. The seat is in blue with red piping. It's extra chrome on the engine, and the gas shocks were fitted for the first time upside down, the Berlin gas shocks.
The larger side panels and upside-down shock absorbers would become standard features on all Bonnevilles from now on. Also, the Bonneville had disc brakes all round to meet with ever-tightening legislation both in Britain and the US. And although all the Jubilees were sold, the Meriden Cooperative was still suffering a chronic shortage of cash. Build quality was also suffering, leading to more time being spent rectifying faults rather than building new machines. Indeed, one of the advantages of some 50% of Jubilees being snapped up by collectors and put away in storage was that warranty callbacks were minimal.
This is the 1979 140D Bonneville Special. It's the American model with the high bars, the small tank, and the 2-into-1 exhaust system.
Few would deny that the T140D was a handsome-looking bike, particularly in its US specification, like this example. The 2-into-1 exhaust was a new option, primarily aimed at the US market, although it was also available on the UK version as an alternative to the more traditional twin-pipe layout. But the US market was all but gone, and in 1980, sales were down to a quarter of the previous year. Some painful bloodletting followed as manpower was reduced in a desperate attempt to survive.
In 1981, and another chance for Triumph to produce a commemorative machine. Charles and Diana's wedding saw the introduction of the royal wedding Bonneville. In both UK and US styles, they both saw the first chrome tank out of Meriden for 25 years. The US version was different in some pretty major ways. The UK had Morris cast wheels, had a silver frame, black engine, and Bing carburetors. The US version had spoke wheels. They used Amul Mark II carburetors, and they had a black frame with silver engine. Produced in a run of about 250, with an additional 50 produced after Royal Wedding that were engraved Royal 1981.
These are the two Bonneville Royals they built at the Triumph factory. They're a limited edition of 250. You've got the English Bonneville Royal here, and you've got the American Bonneville Royal here. And the difference, you can see the differences in them, that one had the mag wheels, one had the spoke wheels. The American one had the 3-gallon tank, and the English one had the bigger tank.
Both British and US versions of the Royal Wedding were very handsome machines and had the luxury of an electric start. The UK versions like this example also had twin-disc front brakes. The US version of the Royal Wedding was the reverse of the UK example, with highly polished or chromed engine parts. Both used German-made Bing carburetors, which were more environmentally friendly than the previous concentric Mark IIs. Both US and UK machines were identical in performance. Time, though, had all but run out on the Meriden Co-op, and 1982 was the last full year of production. But this did not stop Triumph from trying out new ideas.
In an effort to win over those riders that had been put off by rumours or perhaps even fact about excessive vibration from Triumph twins, Triumph developed the T140 AV. AV stood for anti-vibration, and effectively what they did was rubber mount the engine. Norton had done something similar with their isolastic system. Sadly, lack of finance meant that it couldn't be launched to the public at large. 30 or 40 were produced, there was interest from the police and from the military, but it never saw the light of day in a full public availability. Possibly one of the more futuristic T140 derivatives, the TSS engine-based TS81. A one-off. This is a prototype which never saw the light of day. It was launched at the 1980 Earls Court Motorcycle Show on the Abbey Garage stand, but on behalf of the Triumph factory. And they wanted to try public opinion for something this futuristic. It looks a little dated now, but in the 80s, 1980 it was shown, it was pretty futuristic. And it was an instant hit with a lot of the visitors to the show. But peculiarly, the British public didn't like it, whereas the American visitors all said how wonderful it was. The fairing was designed by a guy called Ian Dyson, who actually did the streamlining for racing cars. It is very efficient for what it did. It uses the TSS engine, which was the 8-valve progression of the T140 mounted engine, which is rubber mounted to save vibration. It also had a shorter and stiffer crank, which was more carefully machined. That again did away with a lot of the vibration and meant that the engine was very safe to rev up to 7,000, which was unheard of then. Capable of around 120 miles an hour, it was a pretty forward-thinking machine, but total lack of finance at this late stage in Triumph's operation meant that it wasn't taken any further, and this is the only remaining model of the TS81 in existence. This particular Bonneville was one of the last Bonnevilles built in the factory in 1983. It's the AV rubber-mounted engine Bonneville. And it's also very unique that it's the full fairing Bonneville that never was. It really is one of the last Bonnevilles. I think in 1983 the factory was really due to close, and they were looking at all angles to try and get different customers, and they looked at the executive Bonneville for this customer basis. In 1982, and Triumph, in its continuing search for additional customers to boost flagging revenue, launched the TSX and the TSS in the same year. The TSX was designed to attract the customer. It was completely radical for Triumph. A slightly raked front end, a fat rear tyre, which led to the need to widen the swinging arm, cut out the chain guard, fitted with the low seat, and the big bore exhaust pipes, 1 3/4 inch, and instead of having the front balance pipe, actually had the balance pipe underneath the bike, more unobtrusive, and actually gave a much more striking look to the front of the bike.
The factory was doomed, and in January 1983, it closed its doors for good. The whole lot was sold to John Bloor, a property developer who had other plans for the site. It seemed that the Bonneville was dead.
I'm sitting next to the last Bonneville T140 to leave the Meriden factory. We know it's the last to leave the factory because our museum founder, Bill Crosby, actually had to take up things like the seat, the silencers, to enable the Meriden factory to finish it. It really was that late on in their life. It was almost as if, as Bill wheeled the bike out, the factory gates closed behind him.
But talk of the Bonneville's demise was premature. John Bloor gave West Country Triumph part supplier Les Harris permission to carry on building Bonneville's under license.
This particular model was the Harris Bonneville. Les Harris built these from 1985, I believe, to 1987, possibly 88. This particular model is 00001. It's the first one he built in 85. He was given a license by John Bloor to build these until John Bloor started building his own bikes. This one was built for the Nigerian police force, but it never actually went to Nigeria. It's been in this country all its life. It is virtually brand new with only, I think it's 40 miles on it.
A condition of the license was that Harris Bonnevilles had to conform to the same specification as the last Meriden machines, even though many of the parts were sourced from abroad. But Harris was unable to gain type approval in the US, and without that, there was not enough business in the UK to justify continuing building the Bonneville. In 1988, production ceased. The launch of the Millennium Bonneville in 2000 came at the end of a decade in which John Bloor and his team at Hinckley, Leicestershire, painstakingly rebuilt the Triumph name. Having produced a successful line of triples, it was time to tackle their legendary legacy, the Bonneville.
Bought a Bonneville, brand new one. This is 2001 model, mainly because it's the first bike I've seen in absolutely years, actually, that made me thought, yeah, I want one, because, well, I mean, each their own. These new plastic race replica Japanese things that I don't particularly like. They don't look very comfortable, but this reminds me of the old style bikes that you used to see when you know, when you was a lad and stuff like. So I'm actually in a position these days to actually buy a brand new bike. So I thought it had to be the Bonneville.
It was heartening that the Hinckley factory, the new Triumph factory, who've done so well with their triples, have designed a twin to try and make sure that the Bonneville legend, well, I'm sure it's to try and sell motorcycles and to try and earn themselves an even better reputation for incredible twins as well as incredible triples. But it's nice that the Bonneville legend may well end up living on in what is essentially a better mannered bike. It's the sort of bike that you could introduce to your mother-in-law without her thinking you're an outlaw. Whereas if you try to introduce your old Bonneville, then there will be raised eyebrows. This one is better behaved, it has better table manners, but it is still a Triumph, it's still a twin, it still performs extremely well, just has, I guess, better table manners.
Meanwhile, back at the proving ground, the team from Classic Bike are preparing for the all-important performance shootout. Triumph are also testing a new Daytona, which gives the timing equipment the necessary wake-up call.
The mirrors may give it 1 mile an hour or possibly 2, a fractional increase in top speed. It's always worth a try, and since the other machine has got no rear-view mirrors, I just think it's fair that both are the same. We've found that at 100 miles an hour, with one rear-view mirror, if you remove that rear-view mirror, it gives you 1 mile an hour. So you might get 2 miles an hour from this.
The new Bonneville is up against the 1979 T140V, which has been slightly tweaked by carb specialist Phil Allen. The modifications, however, are aimed at improving reliability rather than outright performance.
I just need to put a little film in, bear with me.
Out on the track, and the older T140 shows that age is no handicap to its performance. In fact, it's marginally faster than the Millennium Bonneville in all the tests carried out during the day, including standing starts, acceleration, and out-and-out top speed tests. But the new Bonneville is not helped by the fact that it's fitted with a rev limiter. Could that be